The wind carried dust like regret, spinning through the empty alleys of Rookridge before settling in the bones of the auction square. A wooden platform groaned under the weight of trade, tools, mules, pride, and this morning, a girl who stood barefoot in a torn calico dress, one sleeve ripped at the seam and the other stained with something darker than rust. She held her chin high, but only barely. Her eyes did not search the crowd. They were locked on the horizon, as if memory or mercy might come galloping through it. Maeve Holloway was 24, but the sun had taken its share, and the nights had taken more. Her hair was thick but dull, pinned hastily with a bone comb. Dust clung to her lashes, her fingernails were lined with ash, and her apron, threadbare and folded in her hands, was the last clean part of her. She did not shiver, not even when the wind teased her bruises. A soft blue mapped across her collarbone, another deepening at her wrist like a chain had once been there. The auctioneer, Edgar Lyle, stood beside her with a crooked grin. His boots were polished, but his soul wasn't, and he called out her qualities like she was a plow with rusted handles. One cook, unwed, no dependents, got all her teeth. He chuckled. A little thin for some tastes, but she can stir a pot, I reckon. A few men laughed. Most didn't look her in the eye. A boy holding his father's coat tugged it and asked, "Pa, why's she standin' like that?" "She's sold shame, son," the man muttered, nudging the boy away. Maeve didn't blink, didn't flinch when Edgar reached out to lift her chin higher for display. She stared past him, beyond the sagging store awnings, beyond the townsfolk and the cracked bell tower, to where the Wyoming hills rolled like a forgotten hymn. "Let's start at $10, Edgar barked. 10 for the lass who knows her way around a stove. A silence swelled. It was crueler than laughter. Someone finally offered 5. 5. Edgar scoffed. She's got both arms, don't she? Can boil beans without crying. You marry one and she'll still burn the biscuits, but this one's just for cookin'. No strings. No stories. Maeve's lip twitched, like she might speak. But the words stayed in her throat, tangled with the last ones her step-uncle had hurled before signing her over for debt and drink. 7. 9. 11. Then silence again. Edgar rolled his eyes. "Shame's cheap today, huh?" That's when the horse's hooves echoed on the boards. Slow. Measured. A giant of a man rode in from the far end of the square, broad-shouldered, dust-caked, with a rifle slung low and a rope coiled like a question mark near his saddle-horn. He didn't speak, just dismounted in one silent motion, taller than most men even without boots built for thunder. Ewan Calder, the widowed rancher of Ash Hollow. He walked forward, slow as a tide. Every step sounded louder than the wind. He looked once at Maeve, just once, and then reached into his coat. Laid down $15 flat. No eye contact. No words. Just a nod. Sold. Edgar barked too quick, as if afraid to lose the moment. To Mr. Calder of Ash Hollow. Maeve didn't move at first. The rope tying her wrists was already gone, but she felt its memory like skin remembers scars. She waited for something. Laughter, insult, a command, but none came. Ewan simply turned and walked back toward his horse, pausing only when he noticed she hadn't followed. "You comin'?" he asked without looking over his shoulder. She followed. The ride out of town was silent. The mare beneath her was broad and calm, unlike her last mount, a stubborn mule that kicked the day she was taken. She sat side-saddle out of necessity, holding her skirt closed at the thigh where the seam had split. Her legs ached. Her ribs pinched. But it was the stillness of the man beside her that unnerved her most. He didn't stare, didn't leer, didn't ask. Finally, when the creek broke through the dry hush and birds scattered like skipped stones across the sky, she spoke. "Am I to warm your bed, too?" The words came out hollow, not flirtatious, not bitter, just tired. Ewan's eyes never left the trail ahead. "No," he said. "Just my stove." They crossed a ridge and entered a canyon thick with cottonwoods. The sun dropped behind the rocks and cast them in amber. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried. Her fingers tightened around the saddle horn. Maeve didn't know what to do with that answer. It wasn't cruel. And that made it dangerous, somehow. She watched his profile in the changing light. His jaw was square, dust lining his temples like salt. There was something in him that had been burned but not broken. A quiet kind of ruin. The ranch appeared just past a crooked fence. Modest, weather-worn, and beautiful in a way nothing built by hands ever is. The porch sagged but held firm. Smoke curled from the chimney, soft and slow, like someone breathing in sleep. He helped her down without touching her skin. Just offered an arm. She used it. Inside, the scent of pine wood and old bread clung to the air. There were boots by the door that hadn't been worn in years, and on a shelf, a line of canning jars with names scrawled across the lids in faded ink. Hannah. Peaches. Late June. He gestured to a corner room. Yours. Sheets are clean. You start tomorrow. Maeve stepped inside. The bed was small but not cruel. A chipped pitcher stood by the window with water cool enough to sting. She washed her face, watched the dirt and shame swirl down into the basin. Her skin looked different without it. Lighter. She peeled off the apron and folded it again, tighter this time. Like it might keep her whole. The sound of boots faded behind the walls. She listened for anything. Laughter, footsteps, a door closing. But there was only the sound of wind brushing the porch rail like a lullaby with no words. She curled up on the bed, one hand still clutching the apron, and stared at the cracks in the ceiling. They looked like veins or roads, or something that was once broken and didn't pretend not to be. She thought of Mrs. Wren, the old cook who'd slipped her cornbread at the auction block and whispered, "Feed them even when you don't feel fed." Maeve hadn't thanked her. She hadn't thanked anyone in a long time. Out on the porch, Ewan stood with his arms folded, staring at the hills. The last light of day caught the side of his face. His eyes flicked toward her window once. Just once. And lingered. She did not see it. But he had noticed the bruises. He had noticed the torn dress. He had noticed her. And he hadn't looked away. The stove was older than her, blackened from years of soot and grease, and Maeve stared at it like one might a confession booth. Iron, square, and unyielding. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the firebox, revealing embers not yet cold. Someone had used it recently. Someone who cared for the heat but not the hunger. She laid kindling down with the caution of a woman handling her own shame. The match flared and died once, then again. The third time it caught. The flame curled into itself like it too was afraid to speak. Behind her, the cabin yawned with quiet. The floor creaked once as she shifted, but the ranch remained still. Ewan hadn't spoken since breakfast. Not that breakfast had happened. There had only been silence, a cup left beside her door, and his footsteps fading as the barn door closed behind him. Maeve burned the eggs. They hissed and clung to the pan like spite. She'd forgotten to oil the cast iron. The edges curled black, yolks hardened into rubber. The scent clawed through the kitchen. She tried to scrape it off in haste, but her hand slipped, and the plate crashed to the floor. A jagged shard bounced near her bare toes. For one startled second, she stood motionless, breath caught in her throat, like she'd just been slapped. Then she bent, gathered the broken pieces, and placed them gently into the ash bucket, as if they were something sacred. The door creaked. Her shoulders tightened. But Ewan didn't enter. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't ask what the noise was. She heard his boots move across the porch boards, slow and steady, then silence. The wind took over again, carrying the faint scent of rain and sawdust through the open window. She looked down at the remains of breakfast, burnt, cold, ugly, and sat beside it on the floor. Her apron was smeared now, just another layer in the day's ruin. She drew her knees close and whispered to no one, "Still here." Later, after washing the pan 3 times, she stepped out to fetch water from the pump. The sky had turned pewter, fat clouds dragging low across the hills like sorrow not yet cried. The pump groaned but gave, spilling cold water into the tin bucket she cradled against her hip. A soft thunk behind her made her turn. Sitting on the stoop was a bundle. Herbs, wild sage, purple onion, and 3 eggs wrapped in cloth. No note. Just that. She stared at it too long. The wind picked up, fluttering the cloth, like it might take flight if she didn't claim it. Maeve took the bundle inside and laid it gently on the counter. The sage smelled like home, or what home might have been if memory hadn't frayed so cruelly. That evening, she tried again. Boiled potatoes with sage and cracked eggs into a skillet she watched like a hawk. She didn't flinch when the oil popped, didn't rush the turn. When the yolk set, she slid them onto a tin plate, one for him, one for her. She left his on the porch rail, careful not to knock. The wind caught her hair and blew it into her eyes as she turned away. He ate, didn't speak, but the plate was cleaned when she returned. In the following days, she settled into a rhythm that didn't quite feel like living, but wasn't dying either. She swept the floor and opened windows. Dusted jars labeled with another woman's script. Hannah, June peaches, canned carrots. She wiped the mantel, tended the kettle, stitched her torn dress with thread she found in the sewing tin by the stove. At night, she sat on the edge of the bed, tracing the outline of the bruises on her wrist. They'd faded, but not entirely. Purple had turned to yellow, like bruises always did. Like they were trying to become something else but hadn't finished yet. The ranch never asked questions. It just stood. Solid. Weather-beaten. Ewan, too, never pried. He worked the land like it owed him something, and he moved with the stillness of a man who had decided long ago that silence was safer than sorrow. She watched him sometimes. From the kitchen window, she'd see him chopping wood shirtless under the early sun, muscles flexing like he was trying to split grief itself. Once, his hand bled from a splinter. He didn't curse, just wrapped it with a rag and kept going. Another time, she found her apron washed and folded on the kitchen table. No words. But it had been hung to dry in the sun, and she hadn't touched it since the auction. Maeve cooked cornbread that night. The smell rose warm and slow, filling the cabin like a hymn. She used her mother's recipe, what little she remembered of it. But when she cracked the last egg, it split too fast, and yolk ran across the counter like spilled gold. She wiped it with the same care she'd used to bury her father's hat years ago. Like some things, even broken, deserved tenderness. As the bread baked, she watched the fire, kneeling before it, fingers near the flames. She didn't flinch. Let the heat reach her skin until it almost hurt. The stove hissed and sighed, and she wondered if it remembered the hands that had tended it before hers. That night, he entered just as she was plating supper. Mud on his boots. Straw in his hair. He paused at the doorway, something unreadable on his face. She placed the plate on the table without a word. Sat opposite him. He took one bite. Then another. Then stopped. Tastes like home, he said, voice rough, like it had been buried in gravel. She didn't speak, but her hand brushed the table near his. Neither moved closer, but neither pulled away. The storm came heavy that night. Thunder rolled like distant drums, and rain lashed the windows. Maeve stood on the porch, hair soaked, face tilted skyward. Her laugh, soft, unsure, escaped her lips as if it had been waiting its turn all year. Inside, Ewan stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. In that moment, she looked wild and young, something beautiful trying to remember its shape. His eyes held her there, but his body stayed back. When she stepped in, dripping, her eyes found his. For a heartbeat, they didn't look away. She moved to the stove, removed the cornbread, broke it in half, gave him the piece with the crust. He said nothing, but that night, when she returned to her room, she found a tin box on her pillow. Inside it, clean thread, 2 buttons, and a silver thimble. The kind gesture of a man who'd noticed her dress had torn again. Her hand trembled slightly as she closed the lid. Then she sat in the dark, holding it to her chest. In the stillness, the stove crackled behind the wall like it had something to say but knew better than to say it. Somewhere beyond the rain and the wind and the silence of this house, her past still howled. But here, tonight, the fire hadn't gone out. And tomorrow he'd see her in the morning, with that same torn dress stitched whole again. The pantry door creaked like an old secret confessing itself. Maeve held her breath as it swung inward, revealing shelves stacked with jars, some dusty, some still gleaming in the dim afternoon light. It smelled of vinegar, thyme, and the forgotten work of a woman who once stood barefoot in this same space. She stepped inside slowly. The wood floor moaned beneath her, and cobwebs clung to the corners where the light couldn't reach. She ran her fingers along the glass. Pickled beets, green beans suspended in brine, wild plums sealed with wax. Each jar had a label written in looping, soft script. The same name appeared again and again. Hannah. The writing wasn't shaky or rushed. It was the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who took her time and believed what she made would last. Maeve touched one of the jars gently, as if Hannah's fingertips still lingered in the ink. Behind her, the fire snapped in the stove and a gust of wind rattled the eaves. But inside the pantry, the silence thickened. She looked down and saw, carved lightly into the wooden shelf at waist height, the same name again, Hannah Calder, etched with a careful tip of a knife or nail. A name that had been here long before Maeve ever crossed the threshold. She stepped back, pulse slowing. She should have known, of course. A man like Ewan hadn't lived alone in this place forever. The jars were too old to be new and too lovingly arranged to be his doing. Still, she hadn't expected to feel the other woman so present, like Hannah might walk in from the fields and ask what she was doing in her pantry. Maeve didn't know whether to be ashamed or grateful. She spent the rest of the day in silence. Cooked a stew from dried beans and a marrowbone he'd left near the chopping block. She didn't season it with sage this time. Hannah might have done that, and Maeve didn't want to echo her too closely. The air felt tight in her chest. As twilight fell, she ventured outside to collect herbs growing wild near the fence. Her dress, freshly mended, brushed against her legs. The land stretched quiet around her. Long shadows spilling down the hills like dusk was pouring out of the earth itself. She saw Ewan then by the west paddock, working to shoe a horse with the help of no one. He cursed softly as the mare kicked, not out of anger but because pain had memory. The horse calmed when he leaned close, speaking to it in tones too low for Maeve to hear. He looked up once, catching her eyes across the pasture. Didn't wave, didn't smile, just nodded, and went back to work. Later, while clearing dishes from supper, Maeve dropped a tin spoon. It rolled beneath the cabinet. When she crouched to retrieve it, she found a box tucked behind a loose board. The lid was dusty, carved with simple whorls, nothing decorative, just private. She didn't mean to open it, but her fingers worked before she could stop them. Inside were folded letters, yellowing at the edges. Most began the same, "My dearest Hannah," all in Ewan's hand, firm, unadorned. One spoke of the creek rising too fast. Another about a new calf born with white around its hooves. The last letter, only half a page long, ended without a signature. It had a tear stain in the center that had bloomed like ink. Maeve folded it carefully, placed it back, and shut the lid. She didn't cry. Not from jealousy. Not from sorrow. But because the grief in the box had weight, and somehow she was now part of the same house that had held it. That night, she didn't light the kitchen lamp. Let the dark settle over her like a blanket stitched from memory. She sat at the table, hands clasped, staring at the pantry door now closed and humming gently in the wind. The next morning, a wagon rattled down the road. Maeve glanced through the lace curtain and saw a neighbor's buggy. Not many came this far. Most kept to themselves. But the man who dismounted, red-bearded, pale-eyed, walked like someone used to testing boundaries. He knocked once. Ewan opened. Maeve didn't hear the words, but she heard the tone, the slight uptilt of smugness in the visitor's voice, the way it curled at the end like a smirk. She dried her hands and stepped to the porch just in time to catch the stranger's gaze. "Well, well," he drawled. "Didn't waste time, did you, Ewan?" Ewan said nothing. The man tipped his hat to Maeve. "Cookin', huh? That what you call it these days?" Maeve's face flushed with heat. Not from shame, but from something older. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but it pressed against her ribs. "She's not yours to comment on," Ewan said quietly. The man laughed. "Ain't mine to worry about either. Just thought it curious, is all. Pretty young woman showing up at your place after years of..." Ewan stepped forward. The man's grin faltered. He muttered something and turned, boots crunching down the path. Maeve hadn't realized she was clutching the hem of her dress. She turned to go inside. Ewan followed. Neither spoke. But that night, she made peach preserves. Opened the jar labeled Hannah, Summer, and dipped a spoonful onto a biscuit. She tasted it with her eyes closed. Then she boiled another batch with new peaches. Sweeter. Softer. She labeled the jar simply, Maeve, Late August, and placed it beside the older one, not in its shadow, but beside it. Later that week, she found a small wooden crate in the barn. Empty. She filled it with dried corn husks and a single apple. Carried it to the kitchen, unsure what she was doing until her hands placed it gently in the pantry beside the preserves. It wasn't competition. It wasn't replacement. It was presence. The following evening, while sweeping the back porch, she noticed something tucked near the edge of the rocking chair, a piece of folded paper weighed down by a smooth river stone. She opened it slowly. It wasn't a letter. Just one line, in Ewan's familiar hand. You don't have to be her. She stared at it a long time. The wind picked up and carried her hair across her face. She brushed it back with fingers that no longer trembled. Inside the pantry, the shadows still waited. But now she stepped into them willingly. The morning light broke slow, filtered through the lace curtains like forgiveness arriving 1 inch at a time. Maeve stood at the stove with flour on her hands, sleeves rolled up just enough to show the edge of a fading bruise near her elbow. She didn't hide it. Not anymore. But she didn't flaunt it either, just let it exist the way some scars belong to the body like seasons to a tree. Ewan walked in quietly, the door creaking just enough to announce him but not enough to startle. He stood a moment at the threshold, hat in hand, boots streaked with clay. His eyes landed on her bare arms, then flicked to the fire, the skillet, the empty chair, anywhere but the bruise. "I'll get more kindling," he said, voice low. "No need," she replied. "I already stacked it." He paused. Their eyes met in the stillness. Something moved between them, not heat, not words, but a knowing. Something that didn't have to be named. Outside, the wind combed through the grass and tugged the laundry on the line. Inside, the room swelled with the scent of bread rising and something else. Something like acceptance, not yet full-grown. Maeve ladled soup into 2 bowls and sat opposite him at the table. The chairs creaked under their weight, not just of bodies but of silences they'd been carrying since the day she arrived. He took a spoonful, chewed slowly, then looked up. "What happened to you?" he asked finally. She blinked once. Not in surprise. She'd known the question would come. She just thought he'd never ask it aloud. "My step-uncle," she said, voice even. "After my father passed, he said I wasn't worth feeding. Said if I couldn't earn my keep, I'd better be sold." Ewan said nothing. His fingers tightened around the spoon. "He tied me up when I ran. Took a belt to my back. Sold me with the same hands he used to baptize his daughter." The fire cracked. "I cooked for him too," she added. "Even with bruises." His jaw moved, but no words came. He reached for his cup, then stopped midway, as if realizing it wasn't thirst that burned. "You deserved better," he said at last. Maeve didn't flinch. Most folks do. They ate in silence. Not cold silence, but the kind that comes after a wound is cleaned, raw, but not festering. Later that day, Ewan rode into town. She watched him leave from the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She didn't ask why. Didn't need to. He rarely left the ranch without reason. She spent the hours in small work, mending a curtain hem, drying herbs, humming a tune her mother used to sing during canning season. The sun crept across the floor in long, patient strokes, casting golden stripes on the worn planks. When he returned, dusk had already begun to drape the sky in lilac. He carried a bundle wrapped in linen and set it quietly on the table. "For your hands," he said. She unwrapped it. New leather gloves, soft-lined and sturdy. She held them like something sacred, eyes flickering up to him. "Thank you," she said, then added, "You didn't have to." "I know," he replied. That night, she brought the gloves to her room and placed them beside the box of thread and the tin of preserves. A shrine of small mercies. She touched each item with care, as if they were notes in a symphony only she could hear. Days passed like that. Quiet, warm, deliberate. Then, one Sunday morning, they rode into town together. Maeve wore her repaired dress and pinned her hair low. Ewan didn't offer his arm, and she didn't ask for it. But they walked in step, a rhythm forming that neither had rehearsed. They stopped at the general store. Children pointed. Whispers followed. "She's the one from the auction," someone murmured. "Cookin' now for Calder. Heard she's taken root." Maeve held her chin steady. Inside, while Ewan gathered supplies, Maeve moved toward the shelf where the baking tins were kept. A woman stepped beside her, tall, powdered, eyes like polished stone. "Must be nice," the woman said lightly. "Being rescued." Maeve looked at her. "I wasn't." "No," the woman replied, glancing down her nose. "Then why else would a man like that bring you home?" Maeve touched the tin gently. "He brought me to cook. I stayed to matter." The woman blinked. And for once, silence worked in Maeve's favor. Ewan returned with a sack of oats and a bottle of vinegar. He glanced at the woman once, then at Maeve, and without asking, placed his hand at the small of her back. Not possessive, not staged, just steady. She didn't pull away. Outside, as they loaded the supplies onto the wagon, he said, "You handled that kind." She offered a small smile. "Been practicing." The road home shimmered with heat. Summer had taken full hold, and the prairie sang with insects and wind. Maeve leaned slightly into the motion of the wagon, hands resting in her lap. She didn't speak. Ewan broke the silence. "You don't owe me gratitude. I know. I didn't expect you to change things." She turned toward him. "What have I changed?" He hesitated. "The house used to echo." She looked forward again. Echoes mean something was there. They passed a thicket of cottonwoods, and the light dappled across their faces. Ewan reached into his coat and pulled something out, a small object wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her wordlessly. She opened it. A silver hair comb. Worn, but elegant. The kind worn by women who once believed in being seen. Maeve held it in her palm, stunned. "It was Hannah's," he said. "I've been keeping it in the drawer." She didn't move for a long moment. "Why now?" she whispered. His voice was steady. "Because I looked closer." Their eyes met, and the wagon wheels rolled on beneath them. That evening, she stood at the mirror, slowly drawing her hair back and slipping the comb into place. It held. It belonged. She turned slightly, watching how the soft light kissed her cheekbones, how the years of shame had softened her but not broken her. At supper, she wore the comb. Said nothing of it. Ewan noticed, but said nothing too. Until, just as the sun was falling behind the hills, and they sat with the last of their meal between them, he asked quietly, "Do you remember what you said your uncle called it, discipline?" She looked up slowly. "Yes." He nodded toward her arm. "That bruise. It made me angry, but I didn't know how to show it." "You didn't have to," she said softly. "You showed me something else." The wind rose and danced across the porch rail. The lantern flickered. Ewan stood, walked to the mantel, picked something up. A ring. Simple, gold, still shining. He turned it in his fingers once, then looked at her. Not asking, not offering, just holding it, like a thought unfinished. "I see you," he said. Maeve's breath caught. The stove crackled. The shadows didn't frighten her now. And the ring hadn't been put away again. Not yet. The wind rose before the sun, tugging at the shutters as dawn stretched across the Wyoming hills in a thin, pink hush. Inside the cabin, the fire hadn't gone out. Embers pulsed under the iron stove like a heartbeat refusing to still. Maeve sat at the edge of her bed, bare feet on the wooden floor, hands folded around the gloves Ewan had given her. Her hair was down, loose like it hadn't been since girlhood, and the silver comb lay on the table beside her. An offering or a memory, she wasn't sure anymore. She stood slowly, the boards creaking beneath her soles, and stepped into the kitchen where yesterday's silence still lingered. The stove welcomed her with warmth, but her hands hesitated over the skillet. For the first time since she'd come, she wasn't sure what to cook. The pantry held plenty, the shelves flush with root vegetables and flour, but it was something deeper she needed to prepare. A moment, a turning, a kind of choice that couldn't be seasoned into being. The porch groaned beneath weight, and then came the knock. Maeve turned, wiping her hands on her apron. She opened the door. Ewan stood there, hair damp with morning sweat, shirt half-buttoned like he'd come straight from work, or from pacing. His eyes weren't their usual steady shade of distant sky. Today they held storm. "Come with me," he said simply. She didn't ask where. She just followed, heart tightening with each step as if her ribs had started shrinking inward. They walked in silence across the yard, past the well, past the barn still warm with the breath of horses. At the far end of the field stood the old fire pit, stones darkened with use, charred wood inside from a night long forgotten. He gestured for her to sit on the tree stump across from him. "I couldn't sleep," he said. She waited. "Every day you've been here, I've watched you patch things. Fix what's broken. The dress. The curtain. That stubborn kitchen door." He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused. "I didn't buy you to be anything more than a cook. And I didn't want more. Not really. I thought I couldn't." Maeve said nothing. Her breath was slow. The air smelled of ash and dry grass. "But then I started noticing everything. The way you stir your tea counterclockwise. The way you hum that old tune when you're making biscuits. The way you touch the pantry shelves like they're someone's skin." He glanced up. The wind caught a strand of hair from her cheek. She didn't move it. "I don't want you to think I pity you, or that I need you just to make the house quieter." She swallowed hard, but her voice was steady. "Then what is it you want, Ewan?" He reached into his coat pocket. "The ring." But he didn't offer it. Not yet. Instead, he stood, walked around the fire pit, and knelt in the dirt in front of her, not with ceremony, but with truth. "I want you to have a name again. One you choose. I want you to know there's nothing in this house that doesn't already belong to you. I want to wake up and see your apron on the hook and know that it stayed because you wanted it to." Her lips parted, but the words caught. "I want to be the man who walks beside you, not ahead, not behind. And I want to grow old with the scent of your stew in my walls." Tears sprang before she could stop them. She covered her mouth with her hand. "Maeve," he said, voice breaking just slightly. "Will you marry me?" She couldn't speak. Just nodded. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit, as if it had always waited for this hand, this moment. She exhaled, slow and deep, and touched his face with the same hand that had once trembled over skillet handles and bruises. That evening, the sun bled gold across the hills. The cabin was full of a gentle stillness that hummed like old music. Maeve cooked. But it wasn't just supper. It was a meal meant for beginning. She seasoned the roast with care, sliced apples into wedges, and even added a pinch of sugar to the gravy like her mother once had, back when Grace still sat at their table. Ewan chopped firewood out back, pausing only once to look toward the window. She stood there, lit by the last light of the day, stirring, humming, barefoot on the cool floor. He came in just as she was lighting the lantern. They sat across from each other at the table again, but this time there was no barrier. Just air, warm and open. She reached for his hand before he could reach for hers. Outside, clouds gathered, dark as coal, promising rain. But inside, the fire kept burning, soft and steady. Hours later, as the wind howled and rain came at last, they lay together, not for desire, not for comfort, but for peace. His hand rested on her waist, and her head against his chest. The storm could not reach them here. Maeve whispered into the hollow of his throat, "You didn't rescue me. You let me come back to life." Ewan kissed her temple. "And you gave me mine." By morning, the storm was gone, and the world was washed clean. The porch glistened with drops. Birds dared their songs again. Maeve stepped outside with her coffee, the comb now fixed in her hair, the ring warming her hand. She looked to the hills, soft and endless, and whispered something only the wind could carry. From behind, Ewan's arm slid around her waist. "Thinking about anything?" he asked. She leaned back against him. "Just everything." They watched the sun rise together, quiet and whole. And inside the house, the stove still crackled. Fire kept burning. Not because it had to, but because someone kept choosing to tend it. If you've ever felt like a thing once broken could never be beautiful again, remember this: beauty isn't what stayed unscarred. It's what rose again anyway. With torn sleeves stitched by hand. With meals cooked in silence. With eyes that dared to meet another's across a worn wooden table. Keep the fire. Keep tending. You're not lost. You're becoming.